Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming back from the coffee break. We are entering the final panel on this international conference entitled Societal Change Post-Arab Spring. My name is Christian Coates-Ulrichsen. I'm a research fellow here at the Baker Institute, and I work on the Arab Gulf states primarily. I've also done a bit of writing on the Arab Spring and the kind of whole set of transitions taking place across countries and the kind of twists and turns of the upheaval that we've seen over the past 3 years. It's a great pleasure to welcome three excellent speakers to finish off this day. We'll begin with Dina Kiwan, PhD, an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology and Media Studies at the American University of Beirut. She used to work from 2006 to 2011 as a senior lecturer in citizenship studies at Birkbeck College, University of London, and co-director of the International Centre for Education for Democratic Citizenship, a joint international centre of Birkbeck and the Institute of Education at the University of London. Her book, Education for Inclusive Citizenship, was with Routledge in 2008 and was awarded joint second prize in 2009 by the Society for Educational Studies. She has extensive policy experience in the domain of citizenship, including in naturalisation and education, spanning the UK, Europe, and the Middle East. She received a BA from Oxford, an MA from Harvard, and a PhD from the University of London. Then speaking second will be Wanda Kraus, PhD, previously an associate professor and coordinator of the Gulf Studies program at Qatar University. Before going to Qatar, Wanda taught Middle East politics at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, at University of London. She studied, worked and researched in Germany, Canada, the UK, Egypt, and the Arabian Gulf, in particular the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. Her thematic areas of research are civil society, gender and women's participation, Islamism, spirituality and activism, and state-society relations. Wanda did her MA in International Relations at the University of Guelph in Canada, and wrote her thesis on feminist and Islamist organizations in Egypt. She holds a PhD in politics at the Middle East from the Department of Politics at the University of Exeter in the UK, and she wrote a dissertation on Arab Gulf civil society, gender, and Islamism. And then ending us will be Valentine Moghadam, PhD, who you will know from the keynote speech this morning, Director of the International Affairs Program and Professor of Sociology at Northeastern University. She was previously Director of the Women's Studies Program and Professor of Sociology at Purdue. In addition to her academic career, she was a Senior Research Fellow at the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research from 1990 to 1995, and a Section Chief at the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, from 2004 to 2006. Valentine's areas of research are globalization, revolutions in social movements, transnational feminist networks, and gender in the Middle East and North Africa. Her current research is on democratization after the Arab Spring. Born in Tehran in Iran, Valentine earned her MA and PhD in sociology at the American University in Washington, D.C. So I'd like to start by inviting Diwan to come and talk.
Well, thank you and good afternoon. And thank you very much to Marwa and to Ariana for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm today going to be talking about Syrian and Syrian Palestinian women in Lebanon. And I'm asking if they're actors of citizenship, and I'll explain what I mean by this. Okay, so in the current context of the Arab revolts, whilst there's been female participation on the streets, human rights organisations have documented that women's rights have actually regressed. With a focus on women's political participation, very broadly construed, what I've tried to do in my paper is to critically analyse how Syrian and Syrian Palestinian refugee women in Lebanon are constructed in official documentation by the international organisations, and I'm focusing on UNHCR and also UNRWA. And then I juxtapose this with exploration of 2 or 3 different initiatives that Syrian and Syrian women refugees are engaged with on the ground. And what I argue is that by acting politically, they constitute themselves as citizens. And I'm drawing on the work of Engin Isin and his idea of acts of citizenship, which I'll get into it as I go through. So given, in particular now what we're facing in the Arab world with the increasing presence of refugee populations, the majority of whom are women, 78% of the refugee populations are women, I'm arguing for the need for a contextualized reconsideration of citizenship, gender, and human rights in the Arab world. So just to give you an idea how I'm going to structure this presentation, firstly I'm just going to give a very brief overview of Lebanon's sociopolitical context and the Syrian refugee crisis. I'll then move on to talking about how refugees have been constructed as a concept, and then also in particular looking at women refugees. And then focusing in particular on UNHCR and UNRWA documentation and how policies are framed in relation to women refugees in the documentation of these 2 organisations. And then just really very briefly highlighting 3 examples of some initiatives in Lebanon that Syrian and Syrian Palestinian women refugees are involved with, before coming to a conclusion and just really some tentative ideas for what the policy implications might be. Okay, so since December 2010, as we know, we've been witnessing widespread revolts across the Arab world. And so it's not unsurprising that there's heightened academic and policy interest in citizenship, democracy, and human rights. And so typically these events are traced to Tunisia in December 2010, when Mohammed Bouazizi set fire to himself in protest against his unlicensed cart being confiscated. And then we see revolts in Egypt, January 2011, where protesters called for the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak, leading to his resignation in February 2011. And then literally days later, revolts starting in Libya, with Gaddafi's regime falling in October 2011. And as we've heard throughout the day, protests have been relatively more limited in the Gulf Arab countries, perhaps with the exception of Bahrain. In addition, protests in Morocco, Algeria, and Jordan, unlike Tunisia and Egypt, have not to date led to the fall of these autocratic regimes. Now, in Syria, popular demonstrations began in March 2011, initially calling for reform, but they quite quickly transformed into demands for the resignation of President Bashar al-Assad. And the protests evolved into armed conflict against government forces. And then by July 2012, the International Committee of the Red Cross described the conflict as a non-international armed conflict, that basically their legal definition for a civil war. Now, the UNHCR describes the current refugee crisis in Syria as, quote, one of the largest refugee exoduses in recent history, with no end yet in sight. And just in terms of some statistics, which you may be familiar with, over 6.5 million people are estimated to be internally displaced within Syria, and that there are expected by the end of this year to be 4 million refugees in the region. And as I mentioned, 78% of the registered refugee population being women and children. Now in Lebanon, which I'm focusing on, conservative estimates, in terms of those who are officially registered, predict 1.5 million Syrian refugees and 100,000 Syrian Palestinian refugees in Lebanon by the end of 2014. And so just to give you an idea in terms of how this relates to the demographics of Lebanon, Lebanon has a population of 4 million approximately. So this is a massive influx of refugees, and it's estimated in terms of the total Syrian refugee population to be about 36% of the refugee population. Now, Now, just to move on to say something about Lebanon, for those of you who are not familiar, just very briefly. So Lebanon is a pretty complicated place. There are 18 recognized religious sects, and you can broadly categorize these into three major sects of Maronite Christian, Sunni Muslim, and Shiite Muslim. And Muhammad Faour describes the politics of Lebanon as, quote, a unique illustration of the intimate connection between religion, demography, and politics. Now, the last census was taken in 1932, and basically the basis upon which political power has been organised is based on that census, although there have been some minor modifications in recognition of a change in demography, especially because of the Civil War context that went on from 1975 to 1990. Now, on top of that, there's a presence of approximately 400,000 Palestinian refugees, and about half of that population live in, there are 12 refugee camps within Lebanon, and they live in pretty dire conditions, probably the worst in the whole Arab world in terms of rights for Palestinians, with denial of basic civil, political, social and economic rights. And they are, for the most part, marginalised and excluded from a Lebanese society. Now, whilst in the early period, so after the creation of the State of Israel, dating back to 48, the early period, Christian Palestinians were naturalised. But there was a growing mistrust of the remaining Palestinian population, who are mostly Sunni. And so it's linked very much to the internal politics and demography. And so most Palestinians have no foreseeable route to citizenship, despite many Palestinians having been born in Lebanon and now actually being third-generation refugees. And so now what we're seeing is more Palestinians coming in from Syria, Palestinian Syrians. And so it's estimated this is a much smaller percentage, number compared to Syrian refugees, but still a not insignificant number of 100,000. And they're under the remit of UNRWA. UNRWA is the organisation that's responsible for Palestinian refugees within the Arab world, whereas UNHCR has responsibility for Syrian refugees. Okay. So just with regard to the state of women's rights in Lebanon, for both citizens and non-citizens, again, we see this inextricable link between the religious and political context. And so I find Suad Joseph's work quite illuminating in her analysis. She argues that in Lebanon what one sees is patrilineality. And so that's the privileging of the father's side of the a person's lineage. She says that this is utilised legally, so patriarchy pervades Lebanon's laws and practices of citizenship. Now, she says, in contrast to the West, which many feminists would characterise as patriarchal, Joseph argues that the mechanisms supporting patriarchy in the West are not patrilineal. That's the difference. And she talks about Lebanon as a society we've already heard in earlier panels today, a society that's organised in terms of kinship that permeates all aspects of social and political life. So there isn't really a distinction between notions of public and private. And she attributes this in part to the context of the weak state, especially weak because of the context of the Civil War, and she describes this as what she calls sectarian political familism. Now, just a few statistics. So in terms of Palestinian refugee women, only 13% are employed in Lebanon compared to 65% of men, based on a study done by UNRWA and jointly with the AUB, published in 2010. What one also sees is an increasing Islamization of Palestinian society since the 1980s. But what Joseph warns us of is the essentialization of women as a category. So whilst, of course, one notes the effects of structural relationships between patrilineality and women's agency, one has to note that, you know, it's not absolutely fixed, and clearly you can see that women's agency will vary according to age, education, social class, religion, nationality, and personal characteristics. And so she characterizes it as that they are not passive recipients of these structural processes, but they work within, through, and against structures for the purposes that they'd like to advance. Okay, so now I'd just like to move on to you know, this category of refugee and what does it mean. And you know, when we hear the term refugee, we think of this in quite sort of fixed terms. But I found that Lisa Malky's work to be very inspiring, really. And in 1995, she published a paper where she did a critical review mapping how refugees have come to be constructed as a domain of knowledge through international law, reports, and other documents produced by the UN and other international refugee agencies, as well as, you know, the vast academic discourses. And she notes that, you know, now very much refugees are cast as a humanitarian problem, but that hasn't always been the case. You know, post World War II, they were actually seen as constructed as a military problem. So that's interesting, you know, just to keep in mind. And in terms of academic discourses on refugees, she notes that there's been quite a strong coupling with the development literature, and she critiques this, saying that this has actually led to us thinking of refugees in a kind of depoliticized and dehistorical way, so kind of outside of their cultural and historical context, and just as people who have certain needs or problems to be dealt with. Another aspect that I think is interesting that she raises is the idea that a lot of how we think of refugees and these movements of refugees is that we have a model of society as something quite sedentary, and so identity is quite essentialized. And so it's the idea that through moving, you know, whether it's chosen or whether it's forced migration, that something is lost through this movement, and that this results in suboptimal psychological functioning, and this reinforces again this depoliticizing and dehistoricizing tendency of this kind of way of thinking about refugees. And I mean, if we look at you know, the case of Syrian and Syrian Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, I mean, there are a couple of features I'll just highlight that kind of challenge this very static notion that we have of refugees. So where you have refugees from Syria residing in Lebanon, what often happens is that they will cross the border back into Syria for various reasons. So, for example, they might be visiting family members, or they might actually go back to access affordable healthcare. Also, for example, with Syrian Palestinians, they're not actually referred to in public discourse as refugees, but rather as displaced persons, immigrants, or guests, because of the political sensitivity regarding the presence of Palestinians in Lebanon, and also given the implications legally of you know, refugee rights. So, for example, with Syrian Palestinians, initially it was the case that on arriving at the border, they could get a visa to enter the country for 1 week, which clearly, you know, is ridiculous, and then pay incrementally for a further extension of 2 weeks. And eventually UNRWA did broker a deal with the Lebanese government where extensions were free and were for 3 months and then for a maximum of a year. But what this has really resulted in is that most Syrian Palestinians are illegal. So as a group, as a population, they are, you know, criminalized. Now, with regards to women refugees, what one often sees in the UN documentation is a narrative about rescue and compassion, which, you know, of course, that is the case, that this is a vulnerable group, and also given the needs for international organizations to be raising funding, and to frame it in humanitarian rather than political terms. But what you see is there is an emphasis on a victimhood, on vulnerability, and so it particularly focuses on such issues as gender-based violence and sexual vulnerability. So it gives a particular image of the woman refugee and determining kind of a priori her needs. Okay, so as I briefly mentioned, clearly, and also if you look at the UNHCR website or UNRWA, that there's a massive archive, large quantities of written documentation. So there are targets, there are key initiatives, there are reports of statistics, policy papers, and so on. And Lisa Malky has talked about all these activities from the perspective of governmentality studies. And so this is an approach influenced by Foucault's writings, where he talked about how governmental power works through the study of technologies, instruments, mechanisms that enable this form of governing. And that although Foucault was writing about the nation-state context, others have argued, for example, Lippert in 1999, that the relevance of governmentality to thinking about the international refugee regime is pertinent here. Now, I looked at quite a lot of documentation. I'm just going to highlight a few points that I pull out for this presentation. So one of the things is the approach of a community development as promoting self-management in communities. And this is predicated on a community-based approach. And they define this community-based approach as a way of working whereby UNHCR aims to work, quote, in partnership with persons of concern during all stages of UNHCR's programme cycle. And it also notes the importance of contextualising this process. So it says it demands that we understand and consider the political context, the receiving population, gender roles, community dynamics and protection risks, concerns and priorities. So the agency of refugees is recognised where UNHCR sees its role as to empower all of the actors to work together to support the different members of the community in exercising and enjoying their human rights. The UNHCR has a section on its website devoted to dealing about information relating to women refugees. And as I've mentioned before, there's an introduction with a general statement, and then it highlights specific risks for women in the context of displacement, mainly as sexual and gender-based violence. It presents UNHCR's role as working to, quote, promote gender equality and ensure their equal access to protection and assistance. So what we see when we look at, what I feel when we look at some of this documentation is that for me it resonates with some of Malky's critique of these kinds of discourses on the vulnerability of refugees and by extension women refugees, because it decontextualizes and therefore depoliticizes refugees' experiences. I'd also argue that by compartmentalizing a group's needs into various categories, this can potentially obscure a coherent understanding of the experience of people's lives as whole people, in effect losing sight of the wood for trees. Now, there is a reference to promoting full participation in all decisions affecting their lives, extending the rationale of participation solely for the purposes of protection. Also, it presents displacement as an opportunity whereby women can take on new roles and instigate positive change. So on the one hand, we can witness a more cautious, depoliticized discourse focused around protection, but there are also suggestions perhaps of a bolder, more holistic and contextualized approach, recognizing the refugee as a whole person coming from a particular sociopolitical context into a new one. So this hints at that rather than characterizing refugee women as only apolitical recipients of humanitarian aid, that they can be seen as political actors in their own right. I just wanted to say something about UNRWA, just to contrast it with UNHCR. I mean, the key point is that people have written about UNRWA as having come to be shaped through its majority of Palestinian staff. And on looking at the documentation, it does seem to have a less developed community participation approach, a more top-down approach in comparison to UNHCR. But I mean, we could talk about that later. I'll just now quickly flag up the three examples of initiatives that I looked at, just to kind of juxtapose, kind of official discourse with some examples of what women are doing. So the first example is a partnership initiative called A Tayyib Zaman, which translates as the most delicious time. And this is a partnership between a Lebanese organisation that has a mission of supporting locally sourced organic produce through farmers' markets, a Catholic charity which focuses on working with migrants and refugees called Caritas, and then also supported by UNHCR. And this was an initiative launched through December 2013 and January 2014. And it was where Lebanese and Syrian women came together and they cooked traditional cuisine for the markets and the restaurant. And this made massive news, both nationally and internationally. It was picked up by CNN. And it was presented, the founder of Suqa Tayyib described it as, the importance of food and culture and an initiative to empower women and so on. And I'm just raising this initiative, even though it's not something that's that women themselves initiated. It's a partnership, just because I think it has some quite interesting features, and also in terms of its possibilities for women in terms of empowerment and what they then went on to do. The second example is something quite different in terms of its actors, its sites, and its scales. And here, this is a more elite group of well-educated women founding various NGOs and networks, and I've just listed there the names of some of these. And so these Syrian women are based in Lebanon, in neighbouring countries, and some are located in Europe and the United States. And some of these organisations were quite well networked in with international organisations. And so, for example, Syrian Women's Forum for Peace partnered internationally with Equality Now, and that was about inclusion in the Geneva II peace talks. The third example is a much smaller scale example. This is an initiative of a Syrian Palestinian woman called Siham Abu Sitta, who lives in Shatila. And Basma Zaytuna is a Syrian NGO that's just recently been registered. And Siham Abu Sitta actually herself has gained an international public profile because she was one of the 5 women in quite a powerful documentary film on Syrian refugee women in Lebanon called Not Who We Are. And so she is the head of this school for 6 to 14-year-olds. And I visited it in January just after it opened. And she's really doing quite amazing work. And so just to really conclude, I feel that these examples call for what Isin says is a new vocabulary of citizenship. And so basically, just to say very briefly, maybe in the questions it will come up more, but I really very much feel inspired by Engin Isin's work on acts of citizenship. He says that, in this world now where there are so many categories of people who are excluded, whether it's migrants, refugees, we've already talked about migrant workers in the Gulf, these categories unsettle or challenge our traditional ways of thinking about citizenship. So he says citizenship is about relationships and acting. It's not just about legal status or practice. And so that when people act, and so I'm saying as these Syrian women and Syrian Palestinian women act, they constitute themselves politically. And I think it also points to us or highlights for us, again, this theme has come up in some of the other presentations, that we need to just perhaps reflect on what civil society means and go beyond just thinking about it in terms of the traditional, more visible forms of associational life, your NGOs. Not to say that NGOs don't do critically important work, but that, especially having seen how things have emerged through the revolts in the Arab world over the last 3 years, that we just need to have our eyes open for new forms of civil society, and that also has implications for funding. Okay, so anyway, I have some policy implications. Shall I just flag up?
Flag them up, okay.
Okay. For UNHCR and UNRWA, it's, as I've already suggested, to have a kind of more holistic discourse about refugees rather than just thinking about them in terms of their needs. And that this not only promotes their basic dignity, but it's also important for local community cohesion. In terms of the Lebanese government, what I would like to flag up is I think that it's not just Lebanon, but the whole region needs to start thinking much more boldly in the domain of citizenship policy. So in the Lebanese context, you know, there's a Palestinian population, there's now a Syrian refugee population, we have massive migrant worker populations in the Gulf. And so we're living in a situation where most of the populations in these nation states are not citizens. And how sustainable is that? And that gender equality is fundamentally part of that. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wanda? Thank you very much.
For my presentation, yeah. Okay, thanks.
We just need to open it here and you're going to go to there we go. Okay.
Great, thank you. All right, thank you, Christiane, for your introduction. Thank you, Dr. Marwa and Ariana, for having me participate today. It's been a real honor and pleasure to hear everybody's presentations. Today I'm talking about women's participation in 2 countries in particular as case studies. These are in Egypt and Qatar. The title of my paper is Post-Arab Spring, Transformations in Need of Feminine Politics. So here I'm taking a slightly different angle from what we normatively do as political scientists. So what I will do is talk about the issue of the Western feminist approach to Middle Eastern women. I know Alexandra has addressed some major points already, so I'll go really quickly through that section. I'll look at quickly cover the objectives and methodology. And then what I'm doing is introducing a new framework I don't think has been applied to political science yet, although politics has been part of the discussion of integral theory. Then I'll go on to the 2 case studies where I will tease out how this theory applies to both countries. My main focus is looking at how women's participation externally, how their actions can be understood through this framework and therefore leveraged, as well as how more internal processes that, for example, Saba Mahmoud has looked at in the case of Egypt, how these can be understood better and also leveraged for women's participation and the evolution of the Middle East. Sorry. So what we're looking at really is, when we're looking at the Middle East and especially women's participation, is through the lens of a Western secular liberal politics, which frames women's consciousness and the women's movement as a shared consciousness, which serves actually to marginalize what women are doing and what women are actually trying to achieve in the Middle East, and the variations within that as well. It largely, for many developing countries, not just the Middle East, it ignores the economic challenges that many women face, especially in the case study that I present today in Egypt. And it underestimates the contextual significance of the actual movements that exist, and I think are also crucial to include. Not that they don't pose sometimes obstacles or issues that we need to look at deeper, but movements such as Islamic feminism and state feminism exist, and I believe we need to work with these as well. What we have for looking at women's participation is a reference made to Molyneux's 1985 distinction, which is made between practical and strategic gender interests for the developing world in general, not just the Middle East. In fact, it was first applied to Latin America. So what practical gender interests are defined as is those that are apparent from the objective conditions women work in and the roles they fill in the gender division of labor. And that's also referred to as feminine gender interests. So that would entail, for example, women trying to leverage mechanisms to attain, say, clean water, housing, electricity. So very, very basic needs, all revolving around the context of poverty. Those termed strategic are feminist. These are groups that are objective-oriented. So these groups in the Middle East or elsewhere are those who are trying to address laws that oppress women, and so changing those laws. So it's very state-oriented, whereas practical gender struggle is very much trying to circumvent government policies, and oftentimes not even addressing government at all. Now, while this distinction does help explain women's participation, it does a lot of damage, I think, in terms of marginalizing women's struggles. The first criticism that you will find in the literature, and I agree with, is its hierarchicalization of strategic struggle over practical or feminine struggle. So it places one over the other as legitimate, and doesn't really see feminine struggle as changing gender dynamics. It completely denies that. So it diminishes the importance of other forms of acting. And my argument is that we must include the economic when poverty is the reality that women are facing. That's for countries such as in Egypt, but also this applies for the Gulf region, where women find greater mobility through their economic mobility, okay, through education and access into the economic sphere. So my argument is that if women's practical needs are addressed, then women are indeed gaining a significant sense of empowerment that matters to them and those they care for. The feminine consciousness is rooted largely in nurturing capacities, and therefore what I term feminine is not exactly the same as practical struggle, although the two can overlap when nurturing capacities are enhanced. But I'd like to go a little bit more into the feminine consciousness. These are nurturing capacities expressed through, for example, mothering, compassion, tolerance, giving, trusting, and then also the civil society variables that I also studied: reciprocating, connecting, restoring, healing, seeking harmony, and collaborating. And I think this is the crux of how change really happens. So essentially what the feminist consciousness is a caring form of being, versus what we observe in the feminist consciousness as basically a war between the sexes, or where we understand struggle to be a war between civil society and the state. And while that might transform politics and dynamics of power relations on some levels, I find through my research it's not the most effective means or mechanisms. So my argument is that by developing feminine capacities, one is primarily working with power from within and developing capacities from within that are enduring. And this is opposed to feminist struggle, which is largely in reaction to power over. Okay, so there's a slight distinction. And in between that, you will find various other modes of power, which is power to do something, power that women derive when they work together on something, so power with. And another mode of power, which I add, which is power for, power to be able to help others to achieve empowerment, for example. Okay, so within certain examples, we find that using the lens of just looking at an oppressive force as power over produces either two reactions, either engagement of disengagement, which I categorize as essentially masculine, rational, and dichotomous, which serves to negate the existence of various other forms of power, which actually do exist and are exercised by women. And in this sense, the feminist project, as is, becomes narrow in its exercise of power, as resistance-oriented. So either you engage or you comply. Feminine-oriented capacity building, I argue, is rather transformative, as it instead works with reproductive power as its primary means for the redistribution of power throughout society from the internal, or what Saba Mahmoud refers to, the subjective, and then out to the external public. So in this way, we are not looking at a separation between the private and public. We are transcending the boundaries. So the objective of this research is to offer an analysis of the capacities and actions that I think are crucially needed for a comprehensive understanding of women's feminisms and the potential of their participation for transformation of the region's current conditions post-Arab Spring, okay, or post-failed Arab Spring. And it offers direction to meeting basic objectives of civility, as we look at culture and civil society, stability and peace, which requires going beyond the analysis of the state-level politics, and including spheres where women's seemingly apolitical actions actually do take place and are politically transformative. So what this paper is about is it's about introducing a new approach to understanding the political import of women's actions. The methods, my question here is how women's feminine capacities in conjunction with strategic action can contribute to the betterment of their conditions and general well-being, stability, and peace in the Middle East. Okay, so I'm looking at things from essentially a systems perspective, where it's not just about women's empowerment, it's women's empowerment and the result of that, which is the development of the Middle East and its condition. And in order to do that, my argument is that we need to include a feminine politics. And to do that, I'm introducing a framework that is called integral theory, and that's based on systems thinking. And through that framework, we can include actions that are observable, which are called exterior within this framework, and actions that are less easily observable and able to quantify. So these are more qualitative measures, interior dimensions. I focus on women in Egypt and Qatar. I studied women in Egypt from 2002 to 2013, and women in Qatar, in Egypt from 2002 to 2013, and women in Qatar from 2011 to 2013. So what you will see here is the typical framework from integral theory. Now, I'll just explain this really briefly. I'll go into a more detailed explanation on the next page. What you have is the subjective experience of an individual in the upper left quadrant. And so that is where we can try to understand the capacities that a person, in our case, a woman is developing within her being. That could be values, that could be a worldview, and that could be various capacities or propensities for whatever action she will take. In the lower left quadrant, we have the intersubjective, which is we. It's I in the plural. It is the culture that we live in and the culture that we are also able to change as individuals collectively. In the upper right, we have the behavioral, so what we can observe individuals doing, so the types of actions that people take. And then in the lower right, that would refer more to the environment that one would find herself in. So the environment that affects her actions. That could be the state, a coercive state, for example, that could limit or confine her actions, such as in an authoritarian state. And so here I would ask questions that I seek to answer in the paper. For understanding the interior, what are individual values? Okay, and what are the subjective processes going on? So how are they changing their values? Okay, presupposing that they can change their worldview, and that's critical and important to changing one's culture and changing one's actions, which you'd find in the interior collective and exterior individual. So in the interior collective, how does one relate to others? That is to some degree observable. So we're looking more at civil society values. So how are people relating to one another in terms of tolerance, trust, reciprocity, cooperation? And then we can also observe such behavior in the exterior. So people all together, what are they doing? What are women trying to achieve? And what tools are they using? Okay, and how are they empowering? And that all is within context, and that must be looked at and studied within context. So in the exterior collective, in the lower right, what is the environment that women are operating in? What are the rules and constitutions that shape their behavior? Okay, and what type of state are we looking at? Okay, so the reason why I use the integral approach is that we need to go beyond the framework of dominance, okay, which narrowly construes male and female imbalances. And we need to identify new forms of desires and objects, relations and discourses that are currently germinating on the individual and cultural levels. And this, I believe, offers an evolutionary way of understanding women's participation and transforming dynamics that exist in terms of power relations. From such perspective, the subjective and the cultural are the first areas actually where we begin. Foucault explains that power cannot be understood merely within the framework of domination, which is the framework we typically apply to understanding women's participation, as something possessed and used by persons or states over others. Instead, it permeates life and produces new forms of desires, objects, relations, and discourses. So it's essential that we use a holistic perspective. Okay. So looking at the case of Qatar, I'm looking at the external frames only, and then for the case of Egypt, I'm looking at the internal frames. Okay, so the external frames here for Qatar, again, are what we can observe people doing and looking at the context in which women are operating. So when I was interviewing in the various organizations that exist to address women's needs, what I found is that everybody, including all experts, say that there's no movement, no women's movement in Qatar. So then I have to go back to the questions within the framework and ask, okay, but we have a context. What tools are they using for their goals? And how are they empowering both themselves and others? Okay, this is the external frameworks. It's necessary that we consider the context of struggle and desire, and therefore the competencies that may be different from Western contexts. Women's avenues for participation in Qatar include two main places: the Qatar Foundation of the Protection of Women and Children, and Qatar Foundation's Family and Consultation Center. So these are two main places that claim to be helping women access rights. There is the women's branch of the Qatar Red Crescent. It was previously called the Qatari Women's Association until 2006. It was established in 1982. I knew that it existed, so I tried to find the women who had participated in this organization to find out where it went, because nobody refers to it anymore as a women's organization. So one member explained that no one wanted to participate with a women's organization in Qatar. So this is already in 2006 where they made the decision to change the name. As soon as we changed the name, we were able to carry out so much more. So instead of calling it a women's organization, okay, it was simply referred to as something, lesser, like a branch to the Qatar Red Crescent. And the goals remain the same: to assist vulnerable individuals, especially women, but specific women in government. They're not really in government, but they are the ones who facilitate programs and actually say whether or not a program is allowed to be established in Qatar. They had changed the mandate to include issues related to environment and health. Okay, so to broaden the mandate so it's more appealing, essentially, and people would participate more. Now, the other two organizations that I mentioned earlier are there for women, but they do not have rights advocacy. Okay, so the one organization for the protection of women and children lets women know what their rights are. So essentially it's telling them what laws are there and educates them if need be, but that's about it. And it has a women's shelter. The other organization, it's really focused on the divorce rate in Qatar. It's not really focused on anything more than that. And so their role is to, when there's a divorce, is to bring the two together and give them advice before getting a divorce. And in most cases, they're successful in stopping the divorce. And what I've found out through interviews with participants is that in most of these cases, there's domestic violence. But they don't understand, that's not discussed. Okay, so looking at context, if there's no rights advocacy and there's no official organization that helps women address any state-led form of human rights abuses, or in any way to change laws, what do women do? Now, it's important to keep in context of not just Qatar, but Bahrain and the UAE, but especially Qatar's size and conservatism. And to look at what women are doing, what tools they're using if they cannot move through these organizations that are essentially gongos. Okay, so they are founded, organized by the state. Now, what they will do is work through other organizations that are not established for women's participation. So in a couple of organizations where I interviewed, they addressed human rights abuses. But the director didn't necessarily know what was going on, okay? So they used the resources, they used the place as a go-to place. People knew where to find these women, and they would address issues related to trafficking. When somebody met into an accident from migrant workers, they would compensate them, so they'd collect money among their networks, help send them back home after treating them, because there's no compensation in Qatar, and so they'd especially target women. Now, within conservatism, what we find is not only that women are doing things kind of underground, but that we also have to look at change within a historical time frame. So what participants kept telling me, and I quote one person here, is that throughout time, things have changed. And so because it's so conservative, we have to expect that change will be slow. She says the first mission I had, which was in 2010, was through an outreach program in Qatar through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but there was huge resistance. I was the only female delegate. Men would not talk to me. Now I am consulted, and men are beginning to call on me. Now, this one participant also goes into male migrant worker areas and addresses various other issues with networks. One being the challenge of AIDS. Of course, that's kept hush-hush in Qatar, but it's quite prevalent in these areas. And they collect resources. They are able to collect quite a huge amount of resources and help these men. So one thing that comes out with being such a conservative state is that if women have to be so subtle and change is so slow, then obviously the people that one would need to rely on are state leaders, such as Sheikh Moza. And I have a number of quotes in the paper too that indicate how much appreciation so many of the participants expressed in terms of what she has done for them. Now, this is also very tricky because not everybody benefits from the changes that she introduces, and foremost are the migrant workers in Qatar and the female migrant workers. But so many women have expressed that they couldn't have achieved what they have, they couldn't be in the places where they are now without her, that it's important to recognize the role that state feminism does play. It does pose obstacles, but it also is an avenue through which perhaps programs can work. Okay, I'm not going to go into Egypt, but what I will go to is policy recommendations really quickly. So what I draw out of the research on Qatar and Egypt is that it is essential to develop and support programs across the Middle East that help women to navigate the ongoing political transitions, and that this needs to be programs that are holistically grounded in methodology that achieve really a systemic change, meaning you're working on the interior and exterior at the same time. You're not just focusing on exterior actions and struggle. And so in order to do that, first we need to recognize that we need to go beyond the framework of domination and the language that that's attached to, as that's narrowly construed. And so we need to create educational and support programs that are rooted in an integral understanding of those dynamic contexts. And for my final slide, policy recommendations, most important is the focus on interior dimensions of consciousness. And so these are skills, capacities, and this could be through self-improvement. And important also is the cultural frames where ideology on the role and position of the female gender is formulated, because this is formulated within organizations, within the home. It's not just what you read in the media or discussed through the discourse of the state. And we need to focus on practical contextual challenges, so for example, poverty. And recognize the movements guiding women's participation that are there and they exist, and they prove to be quite powerful, such as Islamic feminism and state feminism. Transformation in all spheres will influence change within existing power relations, and supporting and developing programs that are integral of a feminine politics, I believe, has powerful implications for political change in the Middle East.
Okay, thank you. With your permission, I'm going to stay seated for two reasons. One is that I missed my afternoon energy boost in the form of a strong cup of coffee. And secondly, because I don't have a PowerPoint, so I might as well just remain seated, eh? Is that all right? Okay. This particular session is called Societal Change After the Arab Spring, and what I thought I might do as a kind of wrapping up is to talk about social changes in general that have occurred in the region over time. It's a little soon to be talking about social change and societal change after the Arab Spring, even though in my own paper and my presentation, I talked about some of the things that had occurred in those three countries, in particular that I focus on, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, that I say are undergoing a democratic transition. But I want to begin by talking about the tremendous changes that have occurred in the region since my point of departure, which is 1979. So what happens in 1979? It's the Iranian Revolution. And I was part of that revolution. I wasn't actually in Iran at the time. I was telling somebody somewhere, maybe at over lunch, that I had a bleeding ulcer and I couldn't go back in the summer of 79 when I wanted to. I was hospitalized instead. But I was part of the student movement, and I was also affiliated with a certain political organization that later became, proscribed, and many of us were persona non grata throughout the 1980s. But 1979 was a massive social revolution, and that, by the way, was our last social revolution. Right. We had these massive street demonstrations in 78 and 79, and women were part of those street demonstrations, but nothing like what happened decades later. And there was absolutely no discourse of women's rights during those demonstrations. That was 79. Now fast forward to 2009. So June 2009, with the green protests in Iran occurring right after a highly contested presidential election. And there, what is absolutely different from 79 is the massive participation of Iranian women in the green protests, wearing different, green ribbons all over the place in their hair, on their wrists, on their ankles, and as pins, and so on and so forth. And they are talking about relaxing the social restrictions, relaxing cultural restrictions, relaxing political restrictions, and women's rights. And then, of course, several years later, we have the Arab Spring, where again, both in terms of numbers, just the numerical aspect of it, we have this massive participation of women in the street protests, and of course, the discourse of women's rights is also front and center. So this is a tremendous change that has occurred over these decades since 1979 and until 2011. The role of women, just in terms of sheer numbers, and also the role of the women's rights agenda being so important and central to the protests in 2009, 2011. Another thing that has really changed, and I think we really saw this today in the different presentations, is the literature and the scholarship on the Middle East in general, and on women in the Middle East in particular. The first edition of my first book, called Modernizing Women, Gender, and Social Change in the Middle East, the first edition came out in 1993. And wow, what a difference in the scholarship between when I was writing that book and finishing it up in the early 1990s, and, for example, by the time the third edition came out, which was just last year in 2013, the literature and the scholarship has just changed so much. When I wrote that book, and the reason I wrote that book is that I was just sick and tired of these analyses about the centrality of culture and religion. That was the single determinant, the single explanatory variable in so many studies, that everything in the Middle East and North Africa, in Muslim countries in general, but especially in that part of the world, could be explained in terms of the centrality of culture and religion. So I was trying to argue that no, that's not the case. There are, other factors and variables that are just important, especially when it comes to female labor force participation. So today we have much more sophisticated analyses, much more sophisticated methodologically, and also in terms of research questions. We have now so many wonderful papers and studies and analyses of women in health, of labor force participation, political participation and representation, and of women's movements and the different types of women's movements that we have in the region too. Wanda talked about Maxime Molyneux's work on practical and strategic gender interests and needs. And of course, another feminist literature distinguishes between women's movements and feminist movements. And we know that in the Middle East, we have had women's movements, feminist movements, and of course, we've also had Islamic feminism. And there's now this wonderful large literature on the subject, and it has really, I think, just created a very, very robust and rich academic scholarship. So instead of this idea in the past that there was this sort of uniform, unchanging, fixed sort of cultural and religious features of this place called the Middle East, now we understand that there have been changes over time, that there are all these variations, and that, for example, countries have different contexts and different approaches to different questions. So, for example, there's the case of Qatar, which you were talking about, and there's, in terms of, for example, women's agency, and there is, of course, the case of Tunisia, which is very, very different. In Tunisia today, they are talking very openly about sexual rights, les droits sexuels, not only les droits des femmes, les droits sexuels. Now, why is that the case? Because the age of marriage is rising. And, young women and young men should have the right to date, or what have you. There is also talk about, and by the way, they are dating. So I was there recently in March, and I was staying in La Berge du Lac, which is this wonderful district, which actually the Saudis built. So there's no alcohol there. However, there is the equivalent of Lover's Lane. Because it's a lake, and I would go jogging in the morning there, and there are all these people of varying ages, by the way, mostly young couples, but I've seen some older ones too, and they are all locked in embrace, and they're just, smooching, and they're holding hands, and they're talking very intimately, and so on and so forth. And as I was jogging past them, I was trying not to be too inquisitive, and I was looking to see, are there any wedding bands there, And I saw one wedding band one time. So, this is a very, very different type of a society. I also held a focus group interview at the University of Tunis, and there were 5 students there. This was after a survey that I had conducted that was administered by 3 academic friends of mine. And there were 3 young men and 2 young women, and they ranged from, one of the guys was a member of UJET. He was a real Marxist-Leninist type. And then we also had a very sort of Ennahda Islamic type who unfortunately had the audacity to say in front of me that Shias are not true Muslims. Anyway, but we also had 2 young women, one of whom was veiled. She believed that inheritance should be equal. It was that veil. So these are some of the assertions, these are some of these democratic aspirations, these are some of the incredible changes that have occurred over time in the Middle East and North Africa, but it also shows the very real differences that exist across countries. And of course, in Morocco, for example, so much has already taken place, but, and we heard some very nice things from Bojim about that, but one of their campaigns is now to decriminalize abortion. And the women's rights organizations are doing this in such a strategically smart way because they're letting the doctors speak. So they are building this campaign, this coalition with the physicians groups as well as with human rights groups. And as one of the feminist leaders was saying to me, we're letting them make the argument for public health, for the rights of lower income women in particular, opportunities and options for them, and so on. So I think that this is all evidence of how much change has occurred. And so rather than that literature that was coming out in the 1970s and 1980s about oppressed Muslim women and oppressed Arab women and so on, to sort of respond to Laila Abu-Lughad's question, do Muslim women need saving? The answer, not only my answer, but their answer would be a resounding no. Leave us alone. We will take care of ourselves. Thank you very much. And they are taking care of themselves through these types of women's organizations, whether they are feminist, women's organizations, or Islamic feminists. And they are doing this sometimes completely outside of the state and in opposition to the state, sometimes with the state in terms of elite allies that they might have in government, and sometimes within the state in terms of some of these ministers or members of parliament who are also advocates for women's rights. I think another point is that what has occurred with the Arab Spring, of course, is that if there were any remaining stereotypes about the region. And of course, these stereotypes I don't think exist in the academic literature anymore, but in the public, yes. But the Arab Spring should have by now shattered every remaining stereotype about this unchanging, timeless region, gender inequality, religion as being uniform and unchanging in the region, and so on. That is simply not the case. There used to be a lot of papers about why, for example, there's so much gender inequality in the region. Why was the region a laggard in this third wave of democracy? Well, I think that these questions are not going to be posed anymore. We now have new research questions, and we saw some of them. We heard some of them today. Marwa asked me to say something about empowerment, and we were just listening to Wanda on the question of empowerment. One of the huge changes that have occurred over these years since 1979, which is always my point of departure to today, is that women's empowerment has now become front and center of many of the agendas across the countries. Not in all the countries, but certainly in many of the countries, and definitely within the Maghreb. And this is the result of both structural changes that have occurred over time, so, urbanization, industrialization, these kind of economic changes, women's educational attainment, labor force participation, and so on. So certainly also changes in the characteristics of the female population has also made them to frame grievances in a certain way and to frame their claims and demands in a certain way too, and to build movements and organizations in a way. And so now they are calling for empowerment, or in the Maghreb, citoyenneté. So that's the word that is used there because of, francophonie, etc. And of course, the whole question of empowerment, citizenship, this is also the result, certainly of those structural changes that I just mentioned, but also of these international and global changes, this global diffusion of this women's rights agenda by the UN and other international organizations, and so on. So empowerment and citizenship become front and center of women's organizations, women's movements, but also of some of the the strategies and plans and the discourses of some of the governments as well. But what do we mean by empowerment, and what do we mean by citizenship? So this is where some of the literature is, can be very helpful, because Wanda rightly said that empowerment, for example, is not just power over. And in fact, in my own work, I have drawn on the work of Stephen Lukes and also my former colleague Bernice Carroll to point out that it's empowerment for and not necessarily empowerment over. And empowerment has to be understood, as with citizenship, as multidimensional. And several of us have actually tried to show those different dimensions of empowerment. Naila Kabir's work shows that very, very nicely. Sylvia Walby and some work that I did myself when I was at UNESCO. So we're talking about the social dimension of women's empowerment, the economic dimension of women's empowerment, the political dimension of women's empowerment. Of course, Bojima talked a little bit about those different measures of political empowerment. empowerment, and also cultural empowerment. Culture is usually shaped and built and so on by, dare I say, men. And whether in terms of ownership and control over the ministries of culture, or in terms of the way that they shape certain types of cultural understandings, norms, or reproduce and perpetuate and reinforce them through certain types of legal frameworks and policy frameworks. And so, how women can gain cultural empowerment, I think, whether through cultural institutions, like I was saying earlier about the different aesthetic expressions of women in Tunisia and in other places, through books, through caricatures and posters and films and all sorts of cultural expressions that way, or through either standing up to some outdated cultural values and norms, or reappropriating them and transforming and translating them in a different way that resonates and that works for women, for women's well-being and women's rights. And the same with citizenship too. We understand that citizenship is not just, the rights of citizens are not just civil and political, although that is absolutely important. And the civil rights of citizenship are particularly important in the Middle East because, as T.H. Marshall pointed out, the right to move, mobility, was an absolutely key right of citizenship that was won by Westerners, by Europeans, by English in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And Middle Eastern women have only recently won that particular civil right. And without that civil right, the right to mobility, the right to move, the right to do things without permission of a guardian, husband, father, brother, uncle, what have you, then you really can't access the other rights. And especially, labor force participation. So that connection is very, very important indeed. In Tunisia, the languages of citoyenneté, and they're very, very keen on full and complete women's citizenship. And the term that they use there is a really interesting one. They say la femme est complète. So this was their answer to this idea that the constitutional debate about let us change the language in the old constitution from equality to complementarity. And the feminist response was no, we are not partners. We are complete human beings in our own right. And that was the discourse that then shaped and transformed the debate in the Constitution. But I think it could only have happened in a country like Tunisia. But that's also evidence of the strength, the empowerment of the women's organizations and of their allies within the Constituent Assembly. Finally, I want to say that the challenges are still quite tremendous after the Arab Spring in the region, and they're mainly economic. We haven't talked very much about economic. Of course, Wanda did talk about the importance of that, but we haven't talked about economic challenges from a macro level. This is where some of these differences that people have talked about, the sub-regional differences, are really very important. So here I'm not talking about the Gulf states with their ample resources and sovereign wealth and personal wealth and so on. But of these so-called real countries with hinterlands with large populations and large labor forces and so on. So the Arab Spring was in very great measure about socioeconomic conditions, the deterioration of socioeconomic conditions, and the popular demands for social rights and economic citizenship. This is really very important part of the Arab Spring, something that I tried to underscore in my presentation and I underscore in various papers that I'm writing, and this is a real challenge to governments. It's also a challenge to democracy theory and practice, but it's a real challenge to the governments because not all the governments are oil rich. not all the governments are resource-based, and not all the governments have a very large tax-paying population, because there's also very high unemployment in these countries. And so, so a real challenge to these countries is to come up with a good economic strategy which will provide for growth with equity. That old-fashioned term from the 1960s, growth with equity. That is what, what is needed. What is also needed is a social policy regime that is developmental and that contributes to a well-functioning labor market. And there are gender dynamics to both of these. And the gender dynamics are really important in many of the larger countries. For example, Lindsay was talking about the employment issue too, and in my work over the years on female labor force participation and patterns of employment, what I've noticed is that the labor forces, or let me back up in saying that educated middle-class women are generally disproportionately represented, and in fact overrepresented in the labor force. In general, there are a few, variations. Morocco and Tunisia, you have some working-class women as well. But generally speaking, the labor force consists of professional women. Okay. So we need policies for working-class women to enter the labor force. We need those policies for their benefit, to increase, obviously, the well-being of their households for women's rights reasons, and also for national economic growth and productivity. So that's absolutely essential. So these policies for maternal employment are mainly have to be addressed to encourage working class women and women from the lower income families to join the labor force. So as I said, the middle class educated professional women are disproportionately represented in the labor force, but by the way, they're also disproportionately represented in the unemployment figures too. So this is just to say that the economic challenges are really quite tremendous in these countries. There are many studies that suggest that one way to help push working class women into the labor force would be, obviously one way would be to change some of these cultural norms, and in part through family law reform, but also to build the necessary institutions and support structures for lower income women, i.e. proper paid maternity leave. It's true that we have maternity leave in most of the countries, but it's not generous at all. It's actually it's generally actually less than what the ILO recommends, and that's why most of the countries haven't even signed on to ILO Convention, 183 on maternity protection. So, okay. So greater female, participation in employment is both, it's good for women and it's also good for economic growth. Okay, let's see, what else did I want to say? I think I only wanted to say that, right. So still on this question of the economic strategy, in Tunisia, people have been talking about, crafting an economic strategy, and there are different debates and discussions going on right now. And so that's a Tunisia-specific challenge because one set of recommendations would have Tunisia sort of continue on the previous path, which was a kind of a liberal, if not neoliberal path. Whereas another set of discussions that are going on in Tunisia really focuses on a more social democratic model with an interventionist state. And people make references to a model that draws from the Nordic experience in terms of a strong, prosperous social democracy, but also the East Asian model of growth and full employment and full utilization of all human resources, including female. And others are also pointing to the Latin American model of participation, consultation, and so on, this more sort of participatory model of the sort of pink wave lefty Latin American countries. So this this is a conversation, this is a discussion and debate that is, is going on in Tunisia. The challenge, I guess, is that if they pursue the liberal model, then the social rights will not be addressed, and there will continue to be protests, uprisings, and dissatisfaction. But if they pursue the social democratic model, that is also a more expensive model. And so the question of where do they obtain the resources becomes really very important. So last but not least, I want to also point out that another big danger and risk in the region, and I don't want to talk about Islamism right now, but I do want to talk about international intervention. Our region has faced intervention since the very beginning. Our region has faced meddling since the very beginning, and Western powers simply don't get it right. They always get it wrong when they meddle and interfere in the Middle East and North Africa. I can say this with great confidence, and I don't think anybody can actually dispute this, whether we are talking about the Arab Revolt in World War I, the Sykes-Picot Treaty, the Balfour Declaration, the coup d'etat against Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, Iraq, Afghanistan, the bombing of Libya, and the fallout from that, etc. They just don't get it right. So I would say Muslim women don't need saving, and actually the Middle East doesn't need saving by any external forces either. So let me leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much for an excellent final panel. I think the technocratic responses to the Arab Spring completely miss the social dimension, which you've spoken about, all three of you, which are completely shattering old certainties and is not a genie that can be put back in the box.
That's true.
Especially the sight of women leading the activism in many of the states and playing such a prominent role in public life will be absolutely game-changing and cannot be wished away or signed away at the stroke of a pen, however much regimes may wish to return to some form of status quo ante. We're running a bit short of time, so I propose to take a few questions and then just give the participants 3 minutes each to respond. So if you have any questions, anybody would like to start? Or are you all?
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Kiwan. Thank you for your presentation. I'm sure you're aware of Andrew March's work on overlapping consensus, and a lot of Islamic studies scholarship has defined citizenship in some kind of relation to ijma and consensus and being part of this larger whole. And what's really exciting about your presentation, if I understood it correctly, was that you were saying that actually voices that disrupt or change the consciousness are actually reflections of citizenship. And if I have that right, that's really exciting for Islamic studies, I would imagine. Women use the term refugee often to describe how they feel in a mosque, or homosexuals, when they go to a gay-friendly mosque, they feel like refugees. And it would be very helpful, I would imagine, if we could change the language of reform and dissent to say this is actually an example of good citizenship. Mm-hmm. Is that fair, or do I have that reading right?
Yes.
Sorry. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think why I'm really drawn to the work of Engin Isin is that he's at the moment doing a big project called Citizenship After Orientalism. It's a big European Council-funded project, and what he was doing, he wasn't only focusing on the Middle East, but basically the project was looking at all sorts of alternative discourses on citizenship, so going to the Far East, going to the Middle East, and there's a lot of scholarship that's coming out of that program. It's been the last 3 years, so I'm very inspired by his work, and that's precisely the characterization that you've given is along those sorts of themes that Isin is proposing, and which I found very helpful for me in framing my work. And I think in the Lebanese context, I mean, citizenship has such a very specific legal connotation. So, for example, when I went to the UNHCR and I was talking to them about their approaches, and they said, what's the title of your paper? And the person was horrified and said, "Oh, please, can't you change the title?" And I said, this is independent research. I'm not characterizing your work, but there's obviously a real political sensitivity around any of their work being seen to be promoting citizenship, whereas I was trying to characterize the sorts of projects that were going on, even some of the projects that UNHCR was partnering, as about this, about different sorts of acts that could be seen, as Isin talks about it, in terms of ruptures. So not your normal acts as disrupting the status quo and actually being acts of good citizenship.
I promise I won't ask more questions. So I'm actually interested, this is actually a question for Dr. Mokhadam. So I hear your description of Tunisia, and the first thing that comes to mind, and I read Eva Bellin's book as well, is corporatism, right? And I'm wondering at the end of the day, like, what role corporatism and corporatism in semi-authoritarian regimes actually plays into these kind of transitions, specifically for women and other interest groups. Because I'm thinking, again, the blueprint, the reason why Tunisia, maybe one of the reasons why Tunisia is actually seeing the progress that you're describing and is capable of seeing it across different interest groups is because it was corporatist in the past, in one respect, and it's in many respects corporatist now, right? So it's easier for it to actually maybe even kind of model itself via the Nordic countries too. And I'm wondering what that means for places such as Morocco or even potentially Algeria, right? And I was curious what you had to say.
Not much right now, we had that little conversation outside, and I need to mull it over. Clearly Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia are, somewhat different in part because of the certain legacies of French colonialism. And some of the legacy actually is positive, believe it or not, in the forms of some of the institutional legacy. Right, the corporatist model, the judicial system, the educational system, and so on. So, these countries are different in that respect. Algeria and Morocco have this sort of robust republicanism, but I need to be less tired and give it a little more thought.
So maybe over dinner, so we can.
One final question.
It's okay. We can do it. I think as we're running out of time, but their shuttle's going to leave that. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Wow. I'm very impressed, and I just want to thank everyone for coming and for participating. It's just an honor to have you all here at the Baker Institute and in our first annual conference. And I hope that we continue this annual conference next year with more conversation and more research. And thank you all again. It was a pleasure. Thank you.